Chapter 13, in which Nicholas varies the monotony of Dotheboys Hall by a most vigorous and remarkable proceeding, which leads to consequence of some importance. The cold, feeble dawn of a January morning was stealing in at the windows of the common sleeping room, when Nicholas, raising himself on his arm, looked among the prostrate forms which on every side surrounded him, as though in search of some particular object. He gazed upon the sleepers at first with an air of one who gazes upon a scene which, though familiar to him, has lost none of its sorrowful effect and consequence, and afterwards with a more intense and searching scrutiny, as a man would who missed something his eye was accustomed to rest upon, and had expected to see. He was still occupied in this search, and had half risen from his bed in the eagerness of his quest, when the voice of Squeers was heard calling from the bottom of the stairs.
"Now then,"
cried that gentleman,
"are you going to sleep all day up there? You lazy hounds,"
added Mrs. Squeers, finishing the sentence, and proceeding at the same time with a sharp sound like that which is occasioned by the lacing of stays. "We shall be down directly, sir," replied Nicholas.
"Down directly," said Squeers. "Aye, you'd better be down directly, or I shall be up directly. Where's that Smike?"
Nicholas looked hurriedly around again, but made no answer.
"Smike!"
shouted Squeers.
"Do you want your head broke in a fresh place, Smike?"
demanded his amiable lady in the same way. Still there was no reply, and still Nicholas stared about him, as did the greater part of the boys, who were by this time roused.
"Confound his impudence!"
muttered Squeers, rapping the stair rail impatiently with his cane.
"Nickleby!"
"Well, sir?"
"Send that obstinate scoundrel down, do you hear me?"
"He's not here, sir," replied Nicholas.
"Don't tell me a lie,"
retorted the schoolmaster.
"He is."
"He is not," retorted Nicholas angrily. "Don't tell me one."
"We shall soon see that," said Mr. Squeers, rushing upstairs. "I'll find him, I warrant you."
With that assurance, Mr. Squeers bounced in at the dormitory, and swinging his cane in the air ready for a blow, darted into the corner where the lean body of the drudge was usually stretched at night. The cane descended harmlessly upon the ground, for nobody was there.
"What does this mean?"
said Squeers, turning round with a very pale face.
"Where have you hid him?"
"I have seen nothing of him since last night," replied Nicholas. "Come," said Squeers, evidently frightened, though endeavouring to look otherwise.
"You won't save him in this way. Where is he?"
"At the bottom of the nearest pond, for all I know," rejoined Nicholas, and fixing his eye full on the master's face.
"Damn you, what do you mean by that?"
retorted Squeers in great perturbation. Without waiting for a reply, he inquired of the boys whether anyone among them knew anything of their missing schoolmate. There was a general hum of anxious denial, in the midst of which one shrill voice was heard to say, as indeed everyone thought, "Please, sir, I think Smike's run away, sir."
"What!"
cried Squeers, turning sharp round.
"Who said that?"
"Tomkins, please, sir," rejoined a chorus of voices. Mr. Squeers made a plunge into the crowd, and at one dive caught a very little boy, habited still in his night gear, and with a perplexed expression on his countenance as he was brought forward, seeming to intimate that he was as yet uncertain whether he was about to be punished or rewarded for the suggestion. He was not long in doubt.
"You think he's run away, do you, sir?" demanded Squeers.
"Yes, sir, please, sir," replied the little boy.
"And what, sir?"
said Squeers, catching the little boy suddenly by the arms and whisking up his drapery in a most dexterous manner.
"What reason have you to suppose that any boy would want to run away from this establishment, sir?"
The child raised a dismal cry by way of answer, and Mr. Squeers, throwing himself into the most favourable attitude for exercising his strength, beat him until the little urchin in his writhings actually rolled out of his hands, when he mercifully allowed him to roll away as best he could.
"There!" said Squeers. "Now, if any other boy thinks Smike has run away, I should be glad to have a talk with him."
There was, of course, a profound silence, during which Nicholas showed his disgust as plainly as looks could show it.
"Well, Nickleby," said Squeers, eyeing him maliciously, "you think he's run away, I suppose?"
"I think it's extremely likely," replied Nicholas.
"Oh, you do you?" sneered Squeers. "Maybe you know he has."
"I know nothing of the kind."
"He didn't tell you he was going, I suppose, did he?" sneered Squeers.
"He did not," replied Nicholas, "and I'm very glad he did not, for then it would have been my duty to have warned you in time."
"Which, no doubt, you would have been devilish sorry to do," said Squeers in a taunting fashion.
"I should indeed," replied Nicholas. "You interpret my feelings with great accuracy." Mrs. Squeers had listened to this conversation from the bottom of the stairs, but now, losing all patience, she hastily assumed her night jacket and made her way to the scene of the action.
"What's all this to do?"
said the lady, as the boys fell right and left to save her the trouble of clearing a passage with her brawny arms.
"What on earth are you talking to him for, Squeery?"
"Well, my dear," said Squeers, "the fact is that Smike is not to be found."
"Well, I know that," said the lady. "And where's the wonder if you get a parcel of proud-stomached teachers to set the young dead dogs a-rebelling? What else can you look for? Now, young man, you just show the kindness to take yourself off to the schoolroom and take the boys with you, and don't you stir out of there till you've been given leave, or you and I may fall out in a way that'll spoil your beauty, handsome as you think yourself to be, and so I tell you."
"Indeed," said Nicholas.
"Yes, indeed, and indeed again, Mr. Jackanapes," said the excited lady, "and I wouldn't keep such as you in the house another hour if I had in my way."
"Nor would you if I had mine," replied Nicholas. "Now, boys."
"Ah, now, boys,"
said Mrs. Squeers, mimicking as nearly as she could the voice and manner of the teacher.
"Follow your leader, boys, and take pattern by Smike if you dare. See what he'll get for himself when he's brought back, and mind, I tell you that you shall have as bad and twice as bad if you so much as open your mouths about him."
"If I catch him," said Squeers, "I'll stop short of flaying him alive. I give you notice, boys."
"If you catch him,"
retorted Mrs. Squeers contemptuously.
"You're sure to. You can't help it. If you go the right way, come, away with you."
With these words, Mrs. Squeers dismissed the boys, and after a little skirmishing with those in the rear, who were pressing forward to get out of the way but were detained for a few moments by the throng in front, succeeded in clearing the room when she confronted her spouse alone.
"He's off,"
said Mrs. Squeers. "The cow-house and the stable are locked up, and he can't be there, and he's not downstairs anywhere, for the girl has looked. He must have gone York way, and by a public road too." "Why must he?" inquired Squeers.
"Stupid!"
said Mrs. Squeers angrily.
He hadn't any money, had he? Never a penny of his own in his own life, so far as I know,
replied Squeers.
To be sure, rejoined Mrs. Squeers, and he didn't take anything to eat with him. That'll I'll answer for. Ha, ha, ha! Ha, 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 ha! Laughed Squeers. Then, of course, said Mrs. Squeers, he must beg his way. And he could do that nowhere better but on a public road. That's true, exclaimed Squeers, clapping his hands. True, yes, but you would never have thought of it for all that if I hadn't have said so, replied his wife. Now, if you take the chaise and go one road, and I borrow Swallow's chaise and go the other, what with keeping our eyes open and asking a few questions, or one another of us is pretty certain to lay hold of him.
The worthy lady's plan was adopted and put in execution without a moment's delay. After a very hasty breakfast and the prosecution of some inquiries in the village, the result of which seemed to show that he was on the right track, Squeers started forth in the pony chaise, intent upon the discovery and vengeance. Shortly afterwards, Mrs. Squeers, arrayed in the white topcoat and tied up with various shawls and handkerchiefs, issued forth in another chaise and in another direction, taking with her a good-sized weapon, several odd pieces of strong cord, and a stout labouring man, all provided and carried upon the expedition with the sole object of assisting in the capture, and once caught, ensuring the safe custody of the unfortunate Smike. Nicholas remained behind in a tumult of feeling, sensible that whatever might be the upshot of the boy's flight, nothing but painful and deplorable consequences were likely to come from it. He lingered on in restless anxiety, picturing 1,000 possibilities until the evening of the next day, when Squeers returned alone and unsuccessful. No news of the scamp, said the schoolmaster, who had evidently been stretching his legs on the old principle not a few times during the journey. I'll have consolation out of this from somebody, Nickleby. If Mrs. Squeers don't hunt him down, so I give you warning. It is not in my power to console you, sir, said Nicholas. It is nothing to me.
Isn't it? Said Squeers in a threatening manner. We shall see. We shall, rejoined Nicholas. Here's the pony run right off his legs and me obliged to come home with a hack cob that'll cost me 15 shillings besides other expenses, said Squeers. Who's to pay for that?
Nicholas shrugged his shoulders and remained silent.
I'll have it out of somebody, I'll tell you, said Squeers, his usual harsh, crafty manner changed to an open bullying. None of your whining vapourings here, Mr. Puppy. Be off to your kennel, for it's past your bedtime. Get out!
Nicholas bit his lip and knit his hands involuntarily, for his finger ends tingled to avenge the insult, but remembering that the man was drunk and that it would come to little but a noisy brawl, he contented himself with darting a contemptuous look at the tyrant and walked as majestically as he could upstairs. Stung to the quick, he lay upon his bed and covered his head with such bedclothes as he had, and sternly resolved that the outstanding account between himself and Mr. Squeers should be settled rather more speedily than Mr. Squeers anticipated. Another day came, and Nicholas was scarcely awake when he heard the wheels of a chaise approaching the house. It was stopped. The voice of Mrs. Squeers was heard, and in exultation ordering a glass of spirits for somebody, which was in itself a sufficient sign that something extraordinary had happened. Nicholas hardly dared to look out of the window, but he did so, and the very first object that met his eyes was the wretched Smike. So bedrabbled with mud and rain, so haggard and worn and wild, that for his garments being such as a scarecrow was ever seen, he might have been doubtful even then of his identity.
"Lift him out,"
said Squeers, after he had literally feasted his eyes in silence upon the culprit.
"Bring him in, bring him in. Take care,"
cried Mrs. Squeers as her husband's proffered fist came to the chaise.
"We've tied his legs under his apron to make 'em fast to prevent his giving way and giving us the slip again."
With hands trembling with delight, Squeers unloosened the cord, and Smike, to all appearance more dead than alive, was brought into the house and securely locked up in a cellar, until such time as Mr. Squeers should deem it expedient to operate upon him in the presence of the assembled school. The news that Smike had been caught and brought back in triumph ran like wildfire through the hungry community, and the expectation of everyone was on tiptoe all morning. On tiptoe it was destined to remain, however, until the afternoon, when Squeers, having refreshed himself with his dinner, and further strengthened himself by an extra libation or two, made his appearance, accompanied by his amiable partner, with a countenance of portentous import, and a fearful instrument of flagellation. That means beating. Strong, supple, wax-ended, and new, in short, purchased that morning expressly for the occasion.
"Is every boy here?"
asked Squeers in a tremendous voice. Every boy was indeed there, but every boy was afraid to speak, so Squeers glared down the lines to assure himself, and every eye drooped and every head cowed down as he did so.
"Each boy keep his place,"
said Squeers, administering his favourite blow to the desk, and regarding with gloomy satisfaction the universal start which it never failed to occasion.
"Nickleby, to your desk, sir."
In any other place, the appearance of the wretched, jaded, spiritless object would have occasioned a murmur of compassion and remonstrance. It had some effect even there, for the lookers-on moved uneasily in their seats, and a few of the boldest ventured to steal looks at each other expressive of indignation and pity. They were lost on Squeers, of course, for his gaze was fast upon the luckless Smike, as he inquired, according to custom in such cases, whether Smike had anything to say for himself.
"Nothing, I suppose,"
said Squeers, with a diabolical grin. Smike glanced round, and his eye rested for an instant on Nicholas, as if he expected him to intercede, but his look was riveted on his desk.
"Have you anything to say?"
demanded Squeers again, giving his right arm 2 or 3 flourishes to try its power and suppleness.
"Stand out of the way, Mrs. Squeers, my dear. I hardly have enough room."
"Spare me, sir," cried Smike.
"Oh, that's all, is it?" said Squeers. "Yes, I'll flog you to within an inch of your life, and spare you that." "Ha, ha, ha, ha!" laughed Mrs. Squeers. "That's a good un."
"I was driven to do it," said Smike, faintly, and casting another imploring look about him.
"Driven to it, were you?" said Squeers. "Oh, so it wasn't your fault, it was mine, I suppose." A nasty, ungrateful, pig-headed, brutish, obstinate, sneaking dog!" exclaimed Mrs. Squeers, taking Smike's head under her arm and administering a punch at every epithet. "What does he mean by that?" "Stand aside, my dear," replied Squeers. "We'll try and find out."
Mrs. Squeers, being out of breath with her exertions, complied. Squeers caught the boy firmly in his grip. One desperate cut had fallen on his body. He was wincing from the lash and uttering a scream of pain. It was raised again and again, about to fall, when Nicholas Nickleby, suddenly starting up, cried, "Stop!" in a voice that made the rafters ring.
"Who cried stop?"
said Squeers, turning savagely round.
"I," said Nicholas, stepping forward. "This must not go on." "Must not go on?" cried Squeers, almost in a shriek. "No!" thundered Nicholas.
Aghast and stupefied by the boldness of the interference, Squeers released his hold of Smike and, falling back a pace or two, gazed at Nicholas with looks that were positively frightful.
"I say it must not," repeated Nicholas, nothing daunted. "Shall not. I will prevent it."
Squeers continued to gaze at him with his eyes starting out of his head, but astonishment had actually for the moment bereft him of speech.
"You have disregarded all my quiet interference in the miserable lad's behalf," said Nicholas. "You returned no answer to the letter in which I begged forgiveness for him, and offered to be responsible that he would remain quietly here. Don't blame me for this public interference. You've brought it upon yourself, not I." "Sit down, you beggar!" screamed Squeers, almost beside himself with rage, and seizing Smike as he spoke. "Wretch!" rejoined Nicholas fiercely. "Touch him at your peril. I will not stand by and see it done. My blood is up, and I have enough strength for 10 such as you. Look to yourself, for by heaven I will not spare you if you drive me on." "Stand back!" cried Squeers, brandishing his weapon.
"I have a long series of insults to avenge," said Nicholas, flushed with passion, "and my indignation is aggravated by this dastardly cruelty practised on this helpless infant in this foul den. Have a care, for if you do raise the devil within me, the consequences shall fall heavily upon your own head." He had scarcely spoken when Squeers, in a violent outbreak of wrath, and with a cry like the howl of a wild beast, spat upon him and struck him a blow across the face with his instrument of torture, which raised up a bar of livid flesh as it was inflicted. Smarting with the agony of the blow, and concentrating into one moment all his feelings of rage, scorn, and indignation, Nicholas sprang upon him, wrested the weapon from his hand, and pinning him by the throat, beat the ruffian again and again and again until he roared for mercy. The boys, with the exception of Master Squeers, who, coming to his father's assistance, harassed the enemy in the rear, moved not hand or foot. But Mrs. Squeers, with many shrieks for aid, hung on to the tail of her partner's coat and endeavoured to drag him from his infuriated adversary, while Miss Squeers, who had been peeping through the keyhole in expectation of a very different scene, darted in at that very moment as the attack began, and after launching a shower of inkstands at Nicholas's head, beat him to her heart's content, animating herself at every blow with the recollection of his having refused her proffered love, with the recollection and the additional strength of her arm, which, as she took after her mother's physique in this respect, was at no time one of weakness. Nicholas, in the full torrent of his violence, felt the blows no more than if they had been dealt with feathers. But becoming tired of the noise and uproar, and feeling that his own arm grew weak beside, he threw all his remaining strength into half a dozen finishing cuts, and flung Squeers from him with all the force he could muster. The violence of his fall precipitated Mrs. Squeers completely over an adjacent form, and Squeers struck his head against it in his descent, and lay at his full length on the ground, stunned and motionless. Having brought affairs to this happy termination, and ascertained to his thorough satisfaction that Squeers was in fact only stunned and not dead, upon which point he had some unpleasant doubts at first, Nicholas left his family to restore him and retired to consider what course he had better adopt. He looked anxiously around for Smike as he left the room, but he was nowhere to be seen. After a brief consideration, he packed a few clothes in a small leather valise, and finding that nobody offered to oppose his progress, marched boldly out by the front door, and afterwards struck into the road which led to Greta Bridge. When he had cooled sufficiently to be enabled to give his present circumstances some little reflection, they did not appear in a very encouraging light. He had only 4 shillings and a few pence in his pocket, and was something more than 250 miles from London, whither he resolved to direct his steps, that he might ascertain, among other things, what account of the morning's proceedings Mr. Squeers transmitted to his most affectionate uncle. Lifting up his eyes, as he arrived at the conclusion that there was no remedy for this unfortunate state of things, he beheld a horseman coming towards him, whom on nearer approach he discovered, to his infinite chagrin, to be no other than Mr. John Browdie, who, clad in cords and leggings, was urging his animal forward by means of a thick ash stick, which seemed to have been recently cut from some stout sapling. You remember that when they last encountered each other, Mr. Browdie had promised to give Nicholas a good hiding. I'm in no mood for more noise and riot, thought Nicholas, and yet do what I will, I shall no doubt have an altercation with this honest blockhead, and perhaps a blow or two from yonder staff. In truth, there appeared some reason to expect that such a result would follow from the encounter, for John Browdie, no sooner seeing Nicholas advancing, that he reined in his horse by the path, and waited until such time as he should come up, looking meanwhile very sternly between the horse's ears at Nicholas as he came up at his leisure. "Servant, young gentleman," said John. "Yours," said Nicholas. "Well, we'll meet at last," observed John, making the stirrup ring under the smart touch of the ash stick. "Yes," replied Nicholas, hesitating. "Come, Mr. Browdie," he said frankly after a moment's pause. "We parted on no very good terms the last time we met. It was my fault, I believe. But I had no intention of offending you, and no idea that I was doing so. I am very sorry for it. Will you shake hands?" "Shake hands?" cried the good-humoured Yorkshireman. "Aye, that I will." At the same time he bent down from the saddle and gave Nicholas' fist a huge wrench. "But what's the matter with thy face, mun? It's all bleeding." "It's a cut," said Nicholas, turning scarlet as he spoke. "A blow. But I returned it to the giver with good interest too." "Oh, no, did they? Ha ha!" exclaimed John Browdie. "Well done! Oh, I like thee for that." The fact is, said Nicholas, not knowing very well how to make the avowal, the fact is that I have been ill-treated.
No,
interposed John Browdie in a tone of compassion, for he was, although a giant in strength and stature, Nicholas was very likely in his eyes, seemingly a dwarf, was nevertheless concerned for him.
Don't say that.
Yes, I have, replied Nicholas, by that man Squeers, and I've beaten him soundly, and am leaving this place in consequence.
What?
cried John Browdie with such an ecstatic shout that the horse quite shied to hear it.
You've beaten the schoolmaster? Oh, ho, ho, ho! Beaten the schoolmaster? Oh, ho! Who ever heard the like? Oh, give me thine hand again, youngster. Beaten the schoolmaster? Oh, dang it, I love thee for it.
With these expressions of delight, John Browdie laughed and laughed again, so loud that the echoes far and wide sent back nothing but jovial peals of merriment, and shook Nicholas by the hand meanwhile no less heartily. When his mirth had subsided, he inquired what Nicholas meant to do. On his informing him he was going straight to London, he shook his head doubtfully and inquired if he knew how much the coaches charged to carry passengers so far. No, I do not, said Nicholas. But it is of no great consequence to me, for I intend to walk.
Get away with you! Going to London afoot?
cried John in amazement. Every step of the way, replied Nicholas. I should be many steps further on by this time, and so good-bye.
Nay, too, replied the honest countryman, reining in his impatient horse. Stand there, I tell ye. Listen, how much cash hast thee?
Not much, said Nicholas, colouring, but I can make it enough. Where there's a will, there's a way, you know. John Browdie made no verbal answer to this remark, but putting his hand in his pocket, pulled out an old purse of soiled leather, and insisted that Nicholas should borrow from it whatever he required for his present necessities.
Now don't be afraid, man, he said. Take enough to carry thee home. They'll pay it back to me one day, I'll warrant.
Nicholas could by no means be prevailed upon to borrow more than a sovereign. That would be £1, but in gold. Which loan Mr. Browdie, after many entreaties that he would accept more, observing a touch of Yorkshire caution, said that if he didn't spend it all, he could put the surplus by till he had an opportunity of remitting it, carriage free. So he was fain to content himself.
Take this bit of timber too to help thee, he added, pressing his stick on Nicholas,
and giving his hand another squeeze.
Keep a good heart, and bless thee. Beaten the schoolmaster! Oh, that's the best thing I've heard these 20 years.
So saying, and indulging with more delicacy than might have been expected from him in another series of loud laughs for the purpose of avoiding the thanks which Nicholas poured forth, John Browdie set spurs to his horse and went off at a smart canter, looking back from time to time as Nicholas stood gazing after him and waving his hand cheerfully as if to encourage him on his way. Nicholas watched the horse and the rider until they disappeared over the brow of a distant hill, and then set forward on his journey. He didn't travel far that afternoon, for by this time it was nearly dark, and there had been a heavy fall of snow, which not only rendered the way toilsome, but the track uncertain and difficult to find after daylight, save by experienced travellers. He lay that night at a cottage where beds were let cheap rate to the more humble of travellers, and rising betimes next morning, made his way before night to Borough Bridge. Passing through the town in search of some cheap resting place, he stumbled upon an empty barn within a couple of 100 yards on the roadside. In a warm corner of which he stretched his weary limbs and soon fell to sleep. When he woke next morning and tried to recollect his dreams, which had all been connected with his recent sojourn at Dotheboys Hall, he sat up, rubbed his eyes, and stared, not with the most composed countenance possible, at some motionless object which seemed to be stationed within a few yards in front of him. "Strange!" cried Nicholas. "Can this be some lingering creation of the visions that I have scarcely left? It cannot be real, and yet I am awake. Smike!" The form moved, rose, advanced, and dropped toward its knees in front of Nicholas' feet. It was Smike indeed. "Why do you kneel to me?" said Nicholas, hastily raising him. To go with you, anywhere, everywhere, to the world's end, to the churchyard grave," replied Smike, clinging to his hand. "Let me, oh, do let me. You are my home, my kind friend. Take me with you, pray." "I'm a friend who can do little for you," said Nicholas, kindly. "How came you here?" He had followed him, it seemed, had never lost sight of him all the way, had watched while he slept and when he halted for refreshment, and had feared to appear before lest he should be sent back. He had not intended to appear now, but Nicholas had awakened more suddenly than looked for, and he had no time to conceal himself. "Poor fellow," said Nicholas, "your hard fate denies you any friend but mine, and I am nearly as poor and helpless as you are yourself." May I go with you?" asked Smike timidly. I will be your faithful, hard-working servant. I will indeed. I want no special clothes," added the poor creature, drawing his rags together. "These will do very well. I only want to be near you." "And you shall be," cried Nicholas, "and the world shall deal by you as it deals by me, till one or both of us shall quit it for a better. Come." And with these words he strapped his burden on his shoulders, and taking his stick in one hand, extended the other to his delighted charge. And so they passed out of the old barn together.